Hi, I'm Jeff Creasy, IT Technology Solutions, and on Monday, August the 3rd, Extreme Networks IT did transform its entire enterprise into a cloud-enabled and managed network using Extreme Cloud IQ. Check this out. From the initial login of Extreme Cloud IQ to the configuring of the network policies which enabled automated device provisioning to the main event, this journey was one of amazingly effortless networking. In this session, we want to share our experiences from an IT perspective. So let's start off with a look at the Extreme Networks IT landscape. Larry, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Hello, everybody. My name is Larry Baker, and I manage network operations here at Extreme. One of our goals is to be Extreme Network's first customer. We want to provide real-world feedback to our product and development teams. And to that end, we run all of our products that make sense in an enterprise environment. In the data center, we use many of the SLX products, from the 9030 to the 9140 to the 9240 and the 9540. On the campus, we use the VSP8404Cs. At the edge, for switching, we're using 460 G2s and 465s. For wireless, the majority of our sites are now using Extreme Cloud IQ 410C access points. We chose this model for a few reasons. The first being it supports the latest Wi-Fi 6 technologies. The second, they're cloud managed and not dependent on any particular location to run wireless controllers. And third, they're tri-radio. So we use one radio for 2.4 gigahertz clients, one for 5 gigahertz, and the third is a dedicated sensor. Because of having a dedicated sensor, we've been able to reduce our access point footprint, and we no longer need dedicated APs for sensors. Like you, Extreme Networks isn't a single vendor for operations. Some of our third-party vendors are Palo Alto for firewall, A10 for load balancers, Silver Peak for WAN optimization, VMware for virtualization, and Dell for server chassis. For collaboration, we're using Zoom and Microsoft Teams. On the business app side, we're using Salesforce, ServiceNow, and Oracle, to name a few. Extreme is a global company. We have offices in all major geos. Here we're showing you some of our medium and large sites. In North America is where our internal data centers are located. They're in Salem, New Hampshire, and Raleigh, North Carolina. The rest of our locations are a combination of GTech, sales, and engineering, and we're spread across North America, South America, EMEA, and the APAC. Like you, our network is ever evolving, and we have a number of legacy devices to replace as Extreme continues its cloud evolution. Chris Collins, IT network engineer, and Gordon Jennings, director for the Extreme Cloud product, led the transformation to a cloud-enabled and managed network. Let's switch over to Chris and Gordon as they explain the journey to Extreme Cloud IQ from an IT customer perspective.
Thanks, Larry. Chris, you and the IT team completed an installation of Cloudbase to replace the Wing and Identify controller-based APs at all Extreme Network offices, and we learned a few things along the way. I'd like for us to cover some of that. We went from a controller-based wireless environment to a cloud-based one, Can you describe the transition?
Sure. So I can tell you that having a fully configured and working global wireless network, the idea of a complete overhaul was intimidating. We had to make sure that we migrated all of the existing configuration perfectly to maintain the exact same security, visibility, supportability, and probably most important, that end user experience, all with no downtime. One of the biggest benefits in transitioning to the cloud was how intuitive the user interface made it. So it wasn't hard to find where to go when I needed help. The support pages were a click away and easy to navigate. Onboarding 500 plus access points was a layup, and a large part of this global revamp essentially became plug and play. Here's a quick demo of me adding an access point to my home network. So there's a couple of different ways to skin this cat. I decided to use a CSV file because obviously I was doing it in the enterprise. So I was onboarding 50 APs at a time. So I was just picking the device type. And there is a CSV file. I'm going to be dragging it in here. And this is what the CSV file looks like. Everything is pretty straightforward. Again, I was doing like over 50 access points at a time. Serial number, host name, there's a bunch of different data you can populate in there. But to be honest, all of the stuff was easy to populate and configure after the fact. So I was just concerned with getting my host name straight and getting the serial numbers up into the cloud. So I simply dragged that CSV file over here. That is my awesome floor plan of my house. I assigned the access point to my basement, assigned my network policy, added the device, come on, and voila. It should be popping up here any second. And there we are. So it goes through, maybe a 10 or 15 minute cycle to get into the cloud, going through software updates and whatnot and rechecking in. But that's it in a nutshell.
Chris, currently you and your team manage 44 sites worldwide. With a controller solution, did you have several geographically located systems, or did you connect to a central one?
So having sites that come in all shapes and sizes and located all over the world, we had to have a distributed solution. As much as we would have liked to deploy a cookie cutter design, that's just not reality. So out of our 44 some odd sites, we have small sites with no on-prem compute resources. They would typically have 1 or 2 access points, and they would connect back to one of our US data centers over a VPN for registration, management, authentication. And then we have mid-sized sites. These sites might have 9 or 10 or 15 access points. Some of these sites might have on-prem compute resources, some not. So typically we would start them off with phoning home, just like we did with the small sites. But if we ran into any issues, whether that's capacity or latency related, we would typically have to deploy a local controller. Then we've got our large sites, multiple floors, 100 plus employees. So these locations absolutely would have server resources, including on-prem controllers, Radius, LDAP servers, NAT gateways servicing their environment. And then there's always the one-offs, where we had to be flexible to accommodate things out of our control. Again, things like the ISPs, the bandwidth, and the geographic latency. But now with the cloud, we're uncomplicating things, and we have as close as we're going to get to a cookie cutter, one size fits most solution.
Extreme Cloud IQ is not geolocation bound. Since you had several geo-based controllers, did you have a struggle coordinating updates and changes?
Sure, there were several struggles with geo-based controllers. Having to maintain common firmware across the entire environment was time-consuming. Things like downloading code, distributing it to regional FTP servers, transferring the image and installing it. We obviously have standards, change control procedures and business coordination to do, allocating an IT resource, often after hours, to manage and validate the software update. So we'll always have the change control and business coordination, but the cloud is going to relieve a lot of that heavy lifting around software management.
As we all know, managing an enterprise wireless environment is a challenging endeavor. Can you describe these challenges and how have you been able to overcome them?
Yeah, so it's always a challenge when you have to manage a dispersed group of devices across different time zones. And as we just talked about, the struggles with software updates. But a huge challenge in managing what I think is a fairly large global network are the one-offs that I mentioned. So for example, imagine having a remote site in Asia Pac, which we have many, with just too much latency to be managed effectively back in the US. Now we've got a pretty robust wide area network. We've got a mixture of SD-WAN, traditional site-to-site VPNs, dynamic routing protocols, but we don't have a global full mesh WAN, although I foresee that coming in the near future. So now we have to, when we come across a situation like this, we have to look at some options. And maybe that's finding a different ISP that can offer better latency, or we have to build a new site-to-site VPN to a geographically closer site that does have on-prem server resources. So this takes time and effort, and then it becomes a burden to track the one-offs and know, for example, now that our Japan access points are now managed out of our India office. So then we've got to know what device to log into in order to find users and troubleshoot and run reports, etc. Now, we did and we still do have a global management system in XMC that made aspects of this easier, because without XMC, it'd be a nightmare. So having that one view of the entire global wireless network is key.
How does a cloud management solution further enhance your ability to seamlessly manage a global distributed environment?
So again, I now have that single pane of glass to drill down to any site, access point, or user simply and easily. All my reports, inventory, troubleshooting tools, network events, and alarms, they're all in one place. The one-off headaches that I just mentioned, they're easy to configure and track. And most importantly, they're easy to see when you're looking at the cloud UI. It's so often that the one-offs get forgotten about. They're not documented. Maybe whoever set them up is no longer with the company. So whatever the case, they used to be a burden to support, not anymore.
Since the migration, what aspects of your workflow and operations have become simpler?
So I've been using the cloud now for about 6 months, so I'm far from an expert, but I'll go back to saying it's very intuitive, the user interface. And just over the last 6 months, the UA had a major overhaul. So many new features have been added, a vast widening of support for our large portfolio of network devices and solutions, and all the while it's maintained its ease of use. The other thing is the changes move very quickly in the cloud, so it keeps me on my toes, but it remains easy to navigate and manage. I would say more so than previous controllers that I've used. And it's kind of fun to wake up, log in, and maybe see a new update was pushed last night. And then I'm able to test that feature or fix right away, anywhere in the environment, pretty safely. So I'll say it again, it's a single system that manages the entire network. Often when you have a large network with distributed solutions, no matter what they are, you need a separate system to be your centralized management platform. And that's yet another system that you've got to maintain.
Can you describe the migration from the controller-based wireless infrastructure to the Extreme Cloud IQ now that we've completed all sites?
Sure. I can start off with giving you my scenario. I work out of RDU in North Carolina, and I was replacing about 50 access points in a 4-story building where we occupy 2 floors of office space. And that included large open lab areas, space with high open ceilings, cubicle areas with low ceilings, and different types of rail and track systems. So as I mentioned earlier, we we did have to pre-configure a lot of the back-end services. So we had to make sure things like NTP and DNS and triple authentication were all set up in the cloud. But after that, the two environments, on-prem and cloud, were both up and running at the same time. So you could seamlessly roam from an on-prem AP to a cloud AP with no more than a packet or two lost, which is virtually unrecognizable from an end user perspective and is pretty common in any roaming situation. So once this was in place, my next step was to get all the APs into a CSV file, like I mentioned, to import into the cloud. So I simply took my shipping order confirmation, I copied and pasted about 50 serial numbers into that CSV file and dragged and dropped it into XIQ. And then I printed out that same spreadsheet to use as a reference for labeling and tracking the access points as I hung them up around the building. Grabbed a push cart and a ladder, and during a business day, I just went from access point to access point and swapped them out one at a time. The only interruption was if an AP was hanging directly overhead, and I had to ask a user to get out of the way for a few minutes. And then it did take about 15 minutes for the access point to boot up. Like I said before, it's going through some update cycles and things like that. So if you don't have a very dense environment, you might want to wait and validate that there's coverage in your area. I was lucky enough. I did have a very dense environment, so I was just blazing through access point to access point. I completed my entire building in probably 5 or 6 hours. And if I had a second person that was helping me push the cart around and open doors for me and hold the ladder, I would have been done in half that time. And then our remote sites. So we have a very small team. So all of our small and mid-sized remote sites migration was carried out by local non-IT staff. And that went seamlessly. These sites received their access points. They would send my team an email with the serial numbers. We would provision the APs into XIQ, and it was plug and play from there.
The cloud may be central to operations, but APs still have to be mounted on site. How did the cloud AP mounting system compare to the others that you have used?
So I can honestly say that between the 3 different mounting brackets, the turn and click system was the easiest one I've used to date. I was able to accommodate every mounting scenario in my building. Like I mentioned, my office has a wide variety of ceiling types and rail systems. And I also haven't heard any complaints from anyone in any of the other sites. In the past, I remember scraping my fingers and knuckles against ceilings, latching and unlatching access points, but I didn't have any issues with these. So again, by far the easiest ones I've used.
A common objection to cloud-based network management is the UI versus the CLI. What was your experience between the UI in comparison to a controller-based on-premise solution?
So to be honest, in troubleshooting situations, I do miss the almost real-time station events and AP logs you can get. Because imagine for sites with on-prem controllers, we're talking about single-digit millisecond latency, or even for remote sites, hundreds of milliseconds. So I'll just have to get accustomed to a few different troubleshooting workflow methods. But I'm already finding some pretty cool tools and utilities that are proving to be pretty capable and powerful. I've been using some cool utilities that you can run directly from the cloud interface, packet captures. There's a CLI window. You can even open up an SSH session directly on the device for some real-time troubleshooting. The minor caveat there is the learning curve of having to know the CLI for the various operating systems. And I'm not sure when this feature came out, but I just discovered the ability to select a device and click on this diagnostics tab, and poof, I've got a drop-down list of over 20 common troubleshooting commands that can get me near, if not all the way, to the root of the issue I'm looking at.
Did you know that most of our competitors do not allow or offer the SSH proxy feature you just mentioned? Speaking of features, which one did you feel gave you the biggest value add?
So there's quite a few, but I'll give you a few of my top mentions. One is that we now have a single global network policy for production. So it's an incredibly holistic way to manage a large enterprise. And I recently created a mirror image of that policy to use for test. There are classification rules that allow us an easy way to accommodate and, most importantly, track one-off cases. They're super flexible. But that mirror image that I've been using for testing, it's pretty cool because I can isolate a single access point and test new features or make changes, and I can understand exactly how it's going to behave in my production environment without having to touch my production policy, and then it can be reverted with a click. So again, there's plenty of ways to accomplish things like that. My point is it's very flexible, and I'm kind of liking the solution that I found just now. Imagine we're managing over 500 wireless devices, 1,000 wired devices. So you need to filter. The filtering options from that single pane of glass are endless. You can drill down and look at a specific site, a specific floor, a specific device type, you name it. And then what I'm finding useful is saving those filters so I can quickly launch preferred views. And lastly, something very worthwhile mentioning is how well the automatic power and channel planning works. I haven't had great experience in the past with auto tuning, so it's pretty awesome when this feature actually works as expected.
We've discussed Wi-Fi cloud management, but Extreme Cloud IQ is moving at cloud speed to unify the management of the wired and wireless infrastructure into a single system, not a collection of systems stitched together via APIs. As we continue to add new features and products on a bi-weekly basis, how do you keep up with the updates, Chris?
Well, quite frankly, it's the help icon. So let's take a quick look what I'm talking about. So I just clicked on the help icon and it popped up almost immediately. There's some very general information about our data centers. These are all the different device types that are supported and are actively being added to it. Release info. I've got everything that was just added, and this is the latest release. And then I'm a click away from all those historical previous releases. And look how easy the navigation is. Everything is just incredibly straightforward and very, very efficient and easy to use.
You mentioned earlier about some of the tools you found and have been using in the cloud. How do the tools in the cloud compare to the ones with a controller solution?
I will go back to the ease of use and intuitiveness that has been built into the cloud and specifically the UI. I can't tell you how many times in the past I've had to test things like authentication for a single user, or if the correct VLANs were built on a port as to why an access point may not be working. So I would have to log into the device, look at logs, and either figure out or already know how to do that. In the cloud, there are straightforward utilities. Like, for example, the two that I just mentioned, there's literally a radius test. I pop in the guy's username, radius server, and boom, I know if he's authenticating correctly. I could do a VLAN probe. Easily tells me what VLANs are built on that access point port. So again, it's very powerful, and again, it's from one vantage point.
Chris, can you share with me some specifics of how it helped you quickly understand where the issues were?
Yeah, recently I had some users complaining about not being able to connect in our Germany office. So on the ML Insights page, I set my filter to that office, and I immediately noticed the score was very low in the network services widget. I clicked on it and drilled down into the health of my DHCP server and saw that it was having up to 30-second response time. This is a simple one. We rebooted the server, response time recovered, and we were back to normal. But if it wasn't for having that one view of our complete network, we could have spent a considerable amount of time tracking down that issue.
Chris, this has been very informative. Thank you. I do have one last question, though. What was your biggest "the cloud rocks" moment?
I don't know how many times I've used this word, but just that it's easy. We have a pretty small team here managing a pretty large network, and it's not just the 1,000+ wired and 500 plus wireless network devices. We've got firewalls, VPNs, SD-WAN, load balancers, phone systems, data and voice circuits. We've got projects to manage, info security to keep up with, new technologies to deploy, offices opening and closing. So we have a staff of 4 people on the network team. So when you have a solution like XIQ in place that takes a huge chunk of that work away with minimal effort, then we actually have time to work on our other projects and be truly benefit to Extreme's operations.
Thank you, Chris. Dan,
My
to you.
pleasure.
Thank you, Jeff, Larry, Chris, and Gordon, for that informative, insightful session. I'm Dan Adam, CIO at Extreme Networks, and we look forward to future engagements with all of you to discuss our Extreme on Extreme program and specifically our Cloudify experience. So in closing, let me cover the top 3 business values of an enterprise network from my CIO perspective. These are: number 1, uptime; number 2, resources required to support; and number 3, overall TCO, total cost of ownership. In regards to number 1, uptime, Cloudify was completed with no business interruptions, seamless to the business. IT was able to pre-configure and set up our global environment in preparation for this 24-hour global rollout. Number 2, resources required. This required a significant reduction in resources due to Extreme IQ, automated device discovery, and provisioning. This eliminated the need to have IT resources at our global locations. Thus, this was an effortless experience. And number 3, TCO. With minimal resource requirements and no business interruptions, this leads to an effective TCO to support, provision, and monitor the network. Thank you for joining our session, and we look forward to you staying tuned for our live Q&A.